Hey, this is Ocean K with a preview of a rack extension that I've been working on that I call Carve. Now, Carve is a dynamic EQ ducker, and what it does is it takes the frequency signature of one audio signal and uses that as a profile to duck or cut the frequencies in a second audio signal. So for example, if you have a guitar track and a keyboard track and they share the same frequency range, they'll end up competing with each other. And so you can use Carve to take out the frequency profile or some or all of the guitar track, for example, and remove those same frequencies from the keyboard track. And you can do it all dynamically with Carve. So just to explain that, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to show an example of Carve just to make sure it's clear what it actually does. And then I'll do a real world example of how you might do it. And then I'll explain a little bit about why you would want to do something like use one reference to take out audio EQ from a second signal. So let's start with a subtractor. And I'm going to reset this, bring up my keyboard. I'm going to set this to be, how about just white noise? Now if we look at the frequency spectrum here, we see we've got a very flat, mostly flat the frequency spectrum here. So that's good enough for now. We're going to create a second subtractor, and in this case, we're going to reset it, and how about let's just create a sine wave. Now, when I play this, okay? Now, the reason I'm playing a sine wave is when you look at the frequency spectrum, sine waves only occupy a very narrow band. Where something like a sawtooth, right, it occupies a much wider band because it's playing overtones here. But a sine wave just plays the pure tone itself. Now, if we select this first subtractor and we insert a carve, now carve you'll see is just inserted between the instrument. It goes into the signal in, and then the signal out goes to the mix channel. So this is just an insert. Carve is an insert effect. But then we're going to route this second subtractor. Instead of going from the subtractor directly to the mix channel, we're going to set the subtractor to go into the carve, and then the carve out to go into the mix channel. And we'll just keep that mono. Okay, so we've got our white noise subtractor going into the signal in and out to the mix channel, and our sine wave is going into the reference in, and the through is going out to its mix channel. So when I play the first subtractor, it sounds just like it normally would. There's no change in sound whatsoever. In fact, we can bring up the frequency spectrum and see our frequency spectrum looks exactly the same. When we play our second subtractor, we see that single frequency. We also see that frequency here on the Carve display screen. Okay? Now, there are actually two graphs here. There's the purple graph and then the blue graph. And I'll explain the difference between them. But the purple graph is going to match what's in this frequency spectrum. Okay? So if I go back to this white noise, I'm going to set the release all the way up so that I can just play it once. And it's just going to keep playing. And now I'm going to go to my second subtractor and play a note. Now, do you notice how there's a cut here? If I look at the frequency spectrum of that sine wave, here's the band. But then if I look at the frequency spectrum of the white noise, as I play the band, you see that it does this cut here. And it does that cut everywhere, right? So it's just wherever that frequency is of the sine wave, that's where it cuts, okay? So it's using let's get rid of these two. So Carve is using the frequency spectrum of this instrument, mapping its profile, and then using that profile as a cut, right, or a duck of this audio signal, right? So it's sort of, it's not mixing these two signals. This signal is playing fine because it's playing through, and this signal is playing fine because it's playing through to its mix channel, but Carve uses this second subtractor to EQ this first subtractor. Okay, does that make sense? So why would someone want something like that? Well, what often happens is you'll have instruments that might share some frequency space, and when they do, they can sometimes get muddy. So for example, if we have, let's just bring two instruments here. We've got an Octarex with just its default sound. We've got an Epic Poly. Yeah, how about, yeah. So why don't we we're going to loop that, and now I'm just going to record, how about, let's just quantize that. Okay, so now, not terribly inspired, but that should give us enough to work with. So if we look at the frequency spectrum of the drums, right? So we see a bass drum here, we see the snare here, right? And we're seeing the hi-hats here, okay? If we look at the frequency spectrum of the bass, we're seeing the sort of tonic, the main tone is here, and here are the overtones up till about here. Now, the kick drum is here, and the bass is here, and so if we listen carefully, we're going to hear that the bass drum gets a little buried whenever the bass plays at the same time. Right? Can you hear that? That the kick drum just gets a little muffled. And so there are a couple ways of dealing with that. You might try to boost the bass or do like an EQ boost or something, but all you're doing is changing the volume, and if you increase the volume of the kick, that's then going to make the bass a little muddy. So you can't just make things louder. What you actually have to do is you have to give both the kick drum and the bass its own space in the frequency spectrum. Now, the way you would typically do this is you would take the bass drum, or the, sorry, not the bass drum, but the bass instrument. Can we even get that low? We can't quite. Right? So maybe we can't even do that. So let's bring in we're going to bring in just an EQ on that. Right, so what I've done is now I've EQ'd this little signal out a little bit. So we still get this, and we can even pump that to give it some color. Right, and so now we have a little more space for the kick drum. And if we listen to the two together, we can hear that it's not getting buried quite as much. Right, so a little more space is being created for that kick drum. The problem is that this EQ exists whether there's a kick drum or not. So first, the kick drum might not come in for, I don't know, 8 measures, or the first chorus of a song or something. So you're EQing out a lot of the low end for the bass in times when you don't actually need it. And the other thing is that even if the drum part is playing the whole time, the kick drum isn't playing the whole time. And so even in each measure, there's a lot of sort of wasted opportunity where the low frequency of the bass could be higher because there's no bass or kick drum that's playing at that point. And so this is just a static EQ, but you can use Carve as a dynamic EQ to cut out the part of the bass only when the kick drum is playing. Okay, so if that's the case, then we want a Carve to EQ the bass drum. So we're going to put Carve as an insert effect for the Thor bass drum, right? So when we play it, it's not EQing anything because there's no reference signal yet. Now we're going to use the octarex as our reference, right? So we've got our octarex going in as the reference, and then our through is going out. Now this through is just a true through, so whatever is going into this signal is going to be coming out of this signal. This doesn't change the audio flow at all. All it does is it reads the audio here. So for this Thor, you could just feed, for the octarex, you could just feed this into a spider, right? And one of the audio outs goes into Carve, and the audio out goes into the other audio out goes into the mixer. That's the exact same thing. I just created this so you don't have to use a spider every time you want to put something in the reference. Okay. So now when we play this, this is the frequency spectrum of the octarex. Now we only care about the bass drum portion, right? So there is a brick wall high pass and low pass filter on the signal. So remember that this purple it's the same thing as this frequency spectrum. The blue is the actual frequency spectrum that is going to be subtracted or used as an EQ cut for, in this case, the Thor. Okay, so you've got this brick wall, high pass and low pass. You can also set the amount, so it has a very large amount, a large cut, or it has a very subtle cut. Okay? And there's also an attack and decay, so you can see that it recovers slowly, right? And that'll give you a bit of a smoother signal, or you can have it attack very slowly, right? So that whole signal is just going to be delayed a little bit. So back to our problem. So if we only want to deal with the kick drum, we can see that that kick drum is only right around there. We're going to want this to have a bigger effect. We're going to want this to attack right away and be a little smoother. So I'm going to mute. Actually, if we just take the drums out, because we're just turning down the mix channel, the signal, the audio signal, is still going through, so we can still see our EQ here. So what we're hearing now is the bass instrument that's playing with the EQ, with the dynamic EQ on its low end. This is it without the EQing. And with the EQing. So if we take the frequency spectrum here, we can see that there's not a lot of activity here, right? We got some, so we can hear the note, but if we bypass it, you see it's a much stronger signal. This is a signal up in the 18 dB, probably 16 to 18 dB range. So we do the on. So we're seeing, we're getting, maybe 6 to 9, sometimes even lower than that, right? So this is a nice cut. So if we bring the drums back in, we can smooth out the attack of the EQ to just give it a little smoother play. And so there we go. We've got two instruments where the frequency range is being sort of respected in both cases, right? Because we've got the kick drum down here, we've got the bass that's actually playing, it looks like a little bit between the kick and the snare, which works just fine. And then we've got our snare up here and our hi-hats up here. And so these two instruments are giving each other space in the frequency spectrum, so it's not going to get muddy in this case. Now again, we can do this with EQ processing, either in the SSL mixer, right? Or we can add an M-class mixer, but then that's not going to be dynamically EQing. It's just going to EQ the entire track. Even if we try to automate it, right, it's not going to automate as quickly as Carve can. And just inserting Carve and linking these two audio signals up, twiddling the knobs a little bit, and we've got a pretty decent job of sort of fixing any conflicts in the frequency spectrum. All right, so that's sort of a long explanation of what Carve is. It's a specialty device. It's really, I only use it for mixing when I have to clear up just frequency mushiness, when there are things that are competing, and instead of having to do it manually, I can just throw in a Carve and it sort of takes care of itself, and it's a pretty nice device. Now, one person has asked, is this the same thing as sidechain compression? Because that often has a similar effect of using one audio signal to change the sound of a second audio signal. But sidechain compression and dynamic EQ ducking are actually totally different things. In part because compression and EQing are two different things. Compression just changes the dynamic range of a signal. So the range between the quietest parts and the loudest parts, that's just compressed, and it may be compressed downward or upward, but compression is about the volume, whereas EQ looks at specific bands in the frequency spectrum and just changes the volume of very specific frequency bands. Multi-band compression tries to get at this a little bit, where if you have 3 or 4 or 5 bands of compression, your frequency spectrum is split up into 3 or 4 or 5 bands. But Carve is a 48 band EQ, so unless you can find a 48 band compressor, you're not going to get the same effect. And even if you did get a 48 band multi-band compressor, the compressor is still only changing the dynamics of the audio signal, not the actual cuts and booster frequency spectrum. So a dynamic EQ ducker is a very different thing than a sidechain compressor. They sort of share the concept of using one audio signal to change the sound of a second audio signal, but they do it in pretty different ways. By the way, just since I'm here, and it was a concern of mine in making this, is I can imagine using many Carves in a single session. So if I'm doing a mix down and I've got, let's say, 24 tracks, I'm probably not going to use a Carve on all of them, but I could very easily see using at least, a dozen Carves. And so DSP footprint was really important to me. So right now with a single Carve, it's not using any DSP. A rack extension itself, just by loading a rack extension, has some overhead. So the fact that there's no DSP is actually pretty impressive at this point. But if I duplicate this, we've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's still, oh, finally a little peak of a DSP. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So I've got 20 Carves here. And if I play this, right, so they're processing, we still only intermittently get 1 bar of DSP on my machine. So Carve I made very specifically to be really, really efficient on DSP, and it seems to be pretty successful that way. Okay, so that's Carve. I finished alpha build, and so it's now working, and I've used it in a couple productions. Looking for beta testers pretty darn soon. There aren't any patches, so we don't need patch development here. But I would be interested in hearing what you think about the device in general, if it's something you could see using in your mixing. Otherwise, if you're interested in being a beta tester, just send me an email at the email address below. All right, thanks so much for watching.